Hello, everybody. Welcome to our lunch and learn here today at the San Francisco Botanic Garden virtually. My name is Ryan Guiu, and I'm the curator at the Botanical Garden. Just as a quick reminder before we begin, this webinar is being recorded, but just so you know, your cameras have been deactivated and you are all on mute, so no worries, no one can see or hear you. If you have any questions today, you can put them into the question Q&A box at the bottom. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome you all to our lunch and learn about Magnolias, one of the garden's most significant and showiest collections we have. You'll be hearing from my team here today. So we have Tori Stewart, who is our plant records manager. And Tori oversees all the record keeping in our collection. So what plant, where it came from, manages our database. And she has a master's degree from the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh in plant taxonomy and biodiversity. And then we will also be hearing from Steve Gensler, our GIS manager. And Steve's been with the garden for 10 years. He took our mapping operation from paper and pencil to a full digital operation. So it's really exciting to have him here, and he'll be talking a lot about our some highlights of our Magnolia map and some of the really unusual and special species that we like to showcase each year. So with all that in mind, Tori, I'll let you kick it off and share all facts of Magnolia with the group today.
All right, thank you, Ryan. All right, everyone's going to share my screen and we will get going. Sorry about that. Okay, here we go. So as Ryan mentioned, we are going to talk all things Magnolias today. And Magnolias are part of the family Magnoliaceae. And Magnoliaceae is one of our basal angiosperms. So angiosperms are flowering plants, and they were one of the first groups to evolve about 54.6 million years ago. So this is a really ancient group of plants. And they once were spread across a wide portion of the northern hemisphere. And we'll talk a little bit more in a bit about their current distribution. And so, you know, magnolias have been around for millions of years, but in sort of our current understanding of them, the name was first referenced in the early 18th century, talking about some plants in Central America. And then the name was officially published in 1753 in Species Plantarum, published by Carolus Linnaeus, the Swedish naturalist. And in this publication, he introduced the concept of binomial nomenclature. And what that is the idea of using a genus and a species to describe or to name all living things. And so this was the publication where we formally introduced that concept, and he took the name Magnolia that had been being used for a short amount of time before that and officially published it to the concept of magnolias that we know today. And many plant names are honorifics, so honoring someone for something, and magnolias are no different. They were named for the French botanist Pierre Magnol, and Pierre Magnol is notable in botany for introducing the concept of plant families. So there's many orders of magnitude sort of organization of groupings of plants. So we have the species and the genus, and then one above genus is the plant family, so a bit of a larger group. And he introduced that concept to us for the first time formally. So we can thank him for plant families and for giving his name to the magnolias that we love. So currently there are 321 accepted species of magnolias around the world. And of these 321, there are 307 that have been assessed by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Red List of Threatened Species, or more colloquially known as the IUCN Red List. And what this is a comprehensive source on the extinction risk for animals, fungi, and plants. So it's a group, experts will produce reports determining sort of what the conservation threats are to populations of living things around the world, and they will submit them to the IUCN Red List, and we sort of have this database of conservation threats. And as you can see, There are many that are considered critically endangered, many more that are considered endangered. And so there's sort of there's a scale that ranges from least concern to extinct in the wild. Extinct in the wild is sort of one below that. So we don't see it in the wild anymore, but it is still somewhere like a zoo or a garden. And as you can see, though, the largest number of Magnolia species is they are data deficient. So that means that we don't have enough information about the current population to really say what the threat status is for that species. Luckily, though, that number is getting smaller every year. It was higher when we were talking about magnolias last year. And so we're learning more and more about the global magnolia population every year. So lots of work is being done on it. And as I mentioned, millions of years ago, magnolias were all over the Northern Hemisphere, but today we see magnolias in North America, South America, and Asia. South America and Central America is an area where we're actually seeing a lot of new species in recent years. Botanists are discovering species that we hadn't known about before. And this is because this area was an area that was sort of not really accessible to researchers for many years, and it's opening up a bit more for plant collection and exploration. So we're seeing a lot of interest in that region and a lot of new species being formally described and talked about in these regions. But Asia is really where our center of diversity for magnolias lie. As you can see on this map here, there are 108 species native to China alone. So that's really where the current global hub of magnolias are. There really are just so many of them there. And in China, the group that we're talking about today as Magnolia is actually split into 11 different genera. So botanists don't always agree on sort of the naming of plants. And so the Flora of China hasn't accepted the name changes that have sort of lumped these 11 different groups into Magnolia. And historically, what we know today as magnolias were actually split into 36 different genera, but with the use of DNA analysis, we have been able to look at them on a genetic level and actually say these plants that we once thought were in 36 disparate groups are actually very closely related under the designation of Magnolia. And like I mentioned, not all of those changes have been accepted by the Flora of China, which is sort of the authority of plants in China. And so there are 11 different genera names that you would have to use to look up this information in the Flora of China. So now talking a little bit about the botany of magnolias and the structure of magnolias. So as I mentioned, magnolias are one of the earliest diverging flowering plants. And so they have what we would consider primitive flowers. And one of the key features of primitive flowers is the presence of tepals, meaning that the plant lacks any differentiation between the petal and the sepal. So you can see in this image on the right that it's an image of a diagram of a rose, which evolved much later than magnolias. And you can see there's the petal here and the lower sepal. And in magnolias, you don't have that differentiation. There's just the tepal, which is sort of an amalgamation of the two. And then you can also see that there are many floral parts. So there's many tepals here. And then there's also many pistils, which are part of the female reproductive organs, and many anthers, which are part of the male reproductive organs. And that has some benefits for pollination, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And here we have images of magnolia fruits. So the magnolia fruit is known as an aggregate of follicles. So what that is as you can see here, there's the many different chambers, essentially, that will have 2 or more seeds inside of it. And then the little chamber will open along a suture or a seam. And then as it opens up, the seeds will kind of burst out out of the seams, and you'll have a situation like this photo on the far right where the seeds are sort of spilling out of the little chambers that they had once been in. And these are often quite large. If you visit the garden and you look at our Magnolia Grandiflora russet right near the fragrance garden, you can see the fruits on them, and they're pretty large. So pretty hard to miss. And then we have the leaves of magnolias, and they are what we would call simple leaves. And that means that the leaves are not divided into smaller leaflets, and they're attached by a petiole to the stem. So as you can see here, it's just one leaf, not divided into any smaller parts. And here's the petiole, and then it connects to the branch there. And the leaves are also alternate. So on the branch itself, you won't have two leaves that are directly across from each other. They'll be staggered along the branch. And most magnolias have evergreen leaves, but there are some that are deciduous. So the evergreen ones, they don't lose their leaves, and the deciduous ones will lose their leaves seasonally. And finally, talking about pollination. So as I mentioned before, Magnolia flower has sort of evolved to work in partnership with its primary pollinator, which is beetles. And so beetles evolved around the same time as magnolias. So they were present when magnolias were evolving millions and millions of years ago. And things like bees and butterflies hadn't evolved yet. And so if you think about a beetle, it kind of lumbers around, and it's not very graceful like you would see in a bee or a butterfly that lands gently on the flower and gets the pollen. The beetles instead are just kind of, going through the flower, and they essentially just bump into the pollen. So the flower really needs to be able to sustain these lumbering bugs going through the flower, and that's why there's these many parts of the flower. So if the beetle knocks off 10 of your anthers, there's still more. You can still reproduce. The flower will be fine. And now talking a little bit more about magnolias specifically at the botanical gardens here. We have 98 taxa in the garden, so that's just sort of individual named units. And we have 56 species, varieties, and hybrids, and 42 cultivars, which are cultivated varieties. And 6 of these cultivars were actually introduced by SFBG. So that's our Magnolia Cambellii striping white, Magnolia Cambellii late pink, Magnolia Cambellii Eric Walter, Magnolia laevifolia striping white, Magnolia sargentiana blood moon, and Magnolia striping pink. And of these 98 taxa, there are 216 individual plants between the collection and our nursery. And this collection was started by our first director, Eric Walter, who had a particular interest in magnolias. And he, during his time at the garden, introduced 17 different magnolia taxa. So far fewer than we have today, but a good basis to start this collection. And one of those taxa that he introduced was Magnolia Cambellii. And sort of a very exciting piece of Magnolia Cambellii's history at the botanical gardens is that we had the first Magnolia Cambellii to flower in all of the United States. So in 1940, it flowered for the first time, and it was major news, national news. People were very, very excited about it. So there's been, a great love of magnolias at the garden since the beginning. And I will now turn it over to Ryan to talk a little bit more about some current news about our Magnolia collection.
Yes, and thank you, Tori. So kind of a fun project we have in the work here at the garden. We have such a diverse collection, and we are doing our best to perpetuate it and keep diversifying it. So through funds provided by Botanic Gardens Conservation International, BGCI, we are conducting a sort of a Magnolia propagation consortium. And so we have linked up with 3 other botanic gardens, UC Botanical Garden across the bay, J.C. Ralston Arboretum, and Atlanta Botanic Garden. And we are we've collected cuttings from a lot of our rare and threatened magnolia species, mostly with wild collected provenance. And we've sent them off to the J.C. Ralston Arboretum, where you can see Leanne Canlie right there. who's processing and grafting and doing all sorts of different methods of magnolia propagation in an effort to, one, learn more about how to propagate these rare species, preserve the wild genetics, and so afterwards, whatever's successful at the end of the year, we're going to be trading with each other, all the different institutions involved, and also if we have extras, share them out with other institutions. So essentially what we're doing is creating insurance policies at different sites. So in the event of a large storm or a tree falls on one of our rare specimens, we actually have backups at other institutions. So it's a really exciting project, and we're excited to see what's successful at the end of the year and learn and see what we've learned.
Yeah, thank you. And then another exciting new feature for our Magnolia season this year is the addition of QR codes throughout the garden. So if you've been to our Magnolia season before and gotten one of our Magnolia maps, you know, you would go around and find the bright pink numbered signs. And this year, on those signs, there's now these QR codes that all you have to do is, if you have a smartphone, just point your camera at the QR code and a link will pop up on your screen, and it will open up Garden Explorer on your phone. And Garden Explorer is our new online component to our plant records database. We started using it back in the fall, and it's a really great feature with lots of information about all of the plants in the collection. But this year, we have expanded information about each of the magnolias on the map. So on the map, there's a couple little lines about each of the magnolias, and then you can get a lot of expanded information about the history of the plant, growth habit, what it likes, you know, growing conditions, that kind of stuff. So all sorts of good information on Garden Explorer when you scan in the QR codes. So that is it for me. And now I will pass it over to Steve.
Thank you, Tori. Greetings, and again, thanks for joining us today. My name is Steve Gensler. I'm the GIS manager at San Francisco Botanical Garden. This year, we've featured 25 magnificent magnolias in the garden, and we thought it might be fun to just discuss a few of our favorites with you. So today, we have 10 highlighted magnolias that we'll be talking about. The rest will require you to explore the garden yourself. So with this talk, I'm hoping to convey two things to you. One, the importance of our collection in terms of conservation, and two, to provide a little history and take a look at the cornerstone of our Magnolia collections through our Eric Walther introductions. So Tori briefly mentioned, talked about Eric Walther, but if you can move on to the next slide. Eric Walther, 1937, he was appointed the first director of the San Francisco Botanical Garden, a position held until 1957. Walther's fascination with magnolias led to the introduction of 17 species, as she mentioned, 12 of which still remain here at the SFBG. So let's get started. Here's a list of the magnolias I intend to discuss today. The numbers you see here will correspond with their place on our magnificent magnolia map. The first being our Magnolia dawsoniana. This is a deciduous magnolia, and we have two mature specimens here at the garden, one just off our Great Meadow in the Mesoamerican cloud forest, and the other is located in temperate Asia. And the species typically blooms in February or March here at San Francisco Botanical Garden. In fact, yesterday I saw several flowers on these trees, high up in the trees. So they have large pink flowers, up to 10 inches, that reflects or droop with age. And additionally, these flowers are borne facing sideways. It was first introduced to the West in 1908 by Ernest Wilson and named after Jackson T. Dawson, the first superintendent of Harvard University's Arnold Arboretum. It's commonly known as Dawson's Magnolia, and native to the mountains of Hunan, Sichuan, Yunnan provinces in China, where it grows at elevations between 1,400 and 2,500 meters. The species is considered endangered by the IUCN, and it's due to intensive commercial logging as well as illegal logging. Its populations have become severely fragmented over the provinces where it occurs, with the remaining forested area of approximately 200 square kilometers, and there's continuing decline in the extent of the forest cover and habitat quality for this species. Next on our list, we have the Magnolia Sharp Eye, which can be found in the Mesoamerican cloud forest. The Sharp Eye is endemic to the highlands of Chiapas, Mexico, where it's found in evergreen cloud forest dominated by an overstory of oak and pine species. The evergreen was discovered by Dr. Faustino Miranda in Chiapas, Mexico, and named after Dr. Aaron Sharp, the chair emeritus of the University of Tennessee Botany Department. This tree is significant to our garden for several reasons. One, our tree was grown from seed collected in 1981 by the late California Academy of Science curator of botany, Dr. Dennis Breedlove. And for those of you who don't know Dennis Breedlove, he's known for his study of plants in Chiapas, Mexico, and provided wild specimens from these trips to the garden among other institutions, and was instrumental in the creation of our Mesoamerican cloud forest dating back to 1984. In fact, this specimen was planted in one of our first plantings in the Mesoamerican cloud forest collection. In terms of conservation, if you go to the next slide, you can see degradation of forest habitat by agricultural clearing, timber harvesting, cattle grazing has resulted in a severely fragmented population, causing this species to be designated as endangered. And here you can see the conversion of this hillside to a low productivity maize crop, which leads to the fragmented populations and less genetic diversity amongst the species. So the next on our list is the Magnolia Solanaceana rustica rubra. It's a mouthful. The cultivar can be found in a couple of locations, one in the Mesoamerican cloud forest, as well as our Camellia garden. And so in 1820, Etienne Solange Boudin pollinated the Magnolia denudata with the Magnolia liliflora to produce this Solanaceana. And since then, many hybrids have been raised, resulting in different cultivars, including the rustica rubra, which is a Dutch clone created at the end of the 19th century from Boskoop, Holland. And so if you look at this, you'll note the reddish purple flowers, which are pink to white within. If you go to the next slide, you can see there's a classic goblet shape, which tend to bloom in the late winter and early spring. I think I took this picture back in the second week of March last year. So, but you can see from this photo the goblet shape. So the Magnolia Solanaceana rustica rubra in the Camellia garden is also an Eric Walther introduction to the garden in 1941. So if we can move on. We have our magnificent Magnolia Cambellii. So this individual is the oldest magnolia in our collection at approximately 99 years young. We received it as a 2-year-old tree in 1924 and planted it in Golden Gate Park by our very own, you guessed it, Eric Walther. It was subsequently moved to its current location in 1939 and bloomed 1 year later. So at age 17, this specimen had the first documented bloom of its species in the US. So if we could go to the next slide here, you can see this is Eric Walther smiling at his magnolia. And I think that the grin on his face says it all, but this was from the Christian Science Monitor back in 1940. In the 1950s, approximately 10 more Magnolia Cambellii were grafted to Magnolia cobus stock and planted throughout the garden. And today, the Cambellii and its variants are the most common magnolia we have here at the garden, with 15 specimens and 14 cultivars and hybrids. It was discovered in Bhutan by naturalist Sir Joseph Hooker, the future director of the Royal Botanic Garden of Kew. And he named that species after Dr. Archibald Campbell, who was the first superintendent of Darjeeling. Archibald negotiated Hooker's admission into Sikkim, Bhutan, and the two traveled around the state on an expedition in which they were imprisoned for over a month. And so in the wild, Magnolia Cambellii grows in the Himalayas at an elevation between 2,100 and 3,300 meters. Here, you can see our Magnolia Cambellii in the background, which is in the Camellia garden. And the picture to the right shows the flower structure. It's also known as the cup and saucer magnolia. It has 4 erect tepals standing upright to form the cup, as you can see right here, and then 8 tepals at a 90-degree angle to form the saucer. So moving on, we have the Magnolia denudata. This can be found in several locations, including the Garden of Fragrance, the moon viewing garden, the Mesoamerican cloud forest, the Camellia garden in Southeast Asia. It's called the Yulon or jade orchid, and it's a deciduous species native to eastern and southern China, where it occurs in montane subtropical forests between 500 and 1,000 meters. It's large, upright, fragrant, lily-like white flowers tend to bloom in late winter and early spring. And again, this is one of the trees that I noticed blooming in the garden as of this week. So the Magnolia denudata was the first magnolia from the Orient introduced to the Western world when it was brought to England in 1780. And the species has a long history of cultivation going back to the Tang Dynasty in 618 AD. And so its beauty was celebrated on ancient Chinese embroideries, scrolls, and porcelains, as you can see in this slide here, and scenes of the countryside. And its elegant flowers made it gift worthy of an emperor. Today, old gnarled specimens can be found in Chinese temples and gardens throughout China. And lastly, this is the parent of many cultivars, the most famous being the Magnolia Selagiana that we discussed previously. So again, the Cambellii and its variants are the most common magnolia we have in the garden, and 6 of these are the Magnolia Cambellii striping white. The striping white that we've highlighted in the moon viewing garden is one of the largest and the oldest trees at SFBG. It stands over 80 feet tall and now 81 years old. And so this special white form was grown from seed purchased from Ghost and Company in India in 1934. It's propagated at Golden Gate Park Nursery and planted here when the Arboretum opened in 1940. And so because of its unique white form, the tree was registered as a natural selection cultivar, and thus the type specimen of Magnolia Cambellii striping white, meaning that all existing true striping whites are a descendant of this very tree that you're looking at. So what is a natural selection cultivar? It simply means that this is not a nursery creation, but rather a natural occurring specimen which has unique characteristics. And in this case, it's the distinct white flowers. And so if you remember, the Cambellii species, also known as the cup and saucer magnolia, had the 4 erect upright tepals forming the cup and the 8 tepals spread widely at a 90-degree angle forming the saucer. Well, the striping white has the 4 tepals facing up, upright, making the cup, but the tepals seem to droop more than the erect Cambellii species. And so that's yet another distinct characteristic of our striping white. This particular cultivar tends to bloom in January and February, and again, another Eric Walther introduction. Moving on, we have the Magnolia adult Sopa. This species was discovered near Kathmandu, Nepal, around 1803, and can be found on the Indian subcontinent, where it occurs in the eastern Himalayan region between 1,000 and 2,400 meters. The evergreen tree will develop beautiful velvety brown buds in the winter, which open to creamy white flowers in the late winter and early spring. As a matter of fact, yet another one which has started to bloom. Its common name is sweet Michaelia, as its flowers are highly fragrant, and often you can smell the sweet Michaelia before you can even see it. The IUCN Red List currently has this as data deficient. However, the eastern Himalayan region is under pressure from unsustainable harvesting of resources for food, firewood, timber, as well as the conversion of forest to agricultural land. As well, in China, the species has significantly decreased due to land conversion for non-native, fast-growing economic species. And its wood itself is highly desirable as well. And it's because of all of this that China has listed this as a national key protected plant. So if you go to the next slide, you can see the velvety brown buds that I'm talking about. They're lovely. And lastly, while this species is commonly used as a street tree in the Bay Area, the specimens we have here at SFBG are some of the largest in cultivation in California. So this is the next slide. This is one of my favorite magnolias and the last to bloom during the magnolia season. Magnolia Vici is a hybrid created in 1907 by Peter Veitch at Royal Nurseries in England. And basically, in an effort to create a magnolia as beautiful as its parents, hardier, and with an extended bloom season, Veach placed the pollen from a Magnolia denudata onto the flower of a Magnolia Cambellii. And so this was the first recorded hybrid of a Magnolia Cambellii. And the new hybrid combined the large pink flowers of the Cambellii with the upright tepals of the almost pure white denudata. And the result was an earlier bloom time and a longer bloom season. So Magnolia Cambellii, the species, can take up to 12 years to flower when vegetatively propagated and 20 years to flower from seed. The Vici has flowered as early as 7 years from vegetative propagation. In addition, while the bloom season is later in the year than the Magnolia Cambellii, the bloom duration is longer. So the flowers emerge with a tinge of purple and then turn entirely green as they mature. And the Vici is a precocious bloomer, meaning that the chalice-shaped flowers appear on the trees before the leaves in the spring. So if you go to the next slide, you can see our Vici in full bloom. This is from the rhododendron garden. We have 3 Magnolia Vici in the garden that flower profusely throughout March, one in the Mesoamerican cloud forest, the Camellia garden, and lastly, the largest can be found in the rhododendron garden southwest of the pavilion. It's believed to be one of the original Vici we received from Victor Reeder Jr., who was the founder of the California Horticulture Society in 1943. And this would be another Eric Walter introduction to our garden. So moving on, so the specific epithet, Amoena, means delightful or beautiful. And this was discovered in China in 1933 and is endemic to Southeast Asia, where it grows at elevations between 700 and 1,000 meters. The IUCN Red List is vulnerable as its population is decreasing. Its population is highly fragmented, and it's believed that the collection of buds for medicinal purposes is believed to be reducing the population's ability to regenerate. The particular tree we're highlighting in bed 14A at the entrance of the Mesoamerican cloud forest was a gift from the Shanghai Botanical Garden and presented to the garden by then Mayor Dianne Feinstein in 1982. Lastly, we have the Magnolia stellata rosea. So it's endemic to Japan, and the specific epithet stellata means star. And so this pink form of star magnolia was introduced in North America by an Oakland nursery sometime after 1885. Subsequently, the Veach nursery in England independently imported from Japan, imported another one from Japan in 1893. And so because of this, the name rosea has been applied to more than a single clone. The species itself, Magnolia stellata, grows at an elevation between 30 and 550 meters and is primarily found in moist, swampy locations. Though it's common in cultivation, it's considered endangered with a decreasing population due to land development, which has fragmented its wild populations. This fragmentation has severely limited the gene flow between populations and is threatening the genetic diversity of the species. And the last slide here is to show you the Magnolia population densities around our garden in order to give you a better idea where you might find more magnificent magnolias. So this concludes our portion of the highlighted magnolias. And I hope you guys will all take the time to come visit and check out the remaining 200 plus magnolias that we have here at the garden. Thanks, and I'll turn it over to Ryan.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Tori, again. This was really fantastic. Even though I've been on this several times, I always learn more every time I hear both my colleagues talk about this. It's a really fun time of the year and really quite exciting. So before, just to remind all of you, please, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box below. And before we open that up, I just want to kind of thank all of you again for coming. You know, we are really excited that we're pursuing this Magnolia propagation project with folks at Atlanta Botanic Garden, J.C. Ralston, UC Berkeley. And so though that project is still underway, we are seeking some matching funds for that to expand it and make sure we can have as big of an impact as possible and spread these rare species out to other gardens. So if you are interested in supporting this project, please by all means get in contact with me, and I'd love to share more about the work that we're doing with it. And so it doesn't, as we're waiting for some questions to come in, I thought I'd ask Tori, so what are some of the top bloomers that are showing off at the garden right now?
Sure. So right now we are seeing the Magnolia Cambellii are definitely in full bloom, especially down in the Camellia garden. And the denudatas are starting to go. So again, down sort of between the moon viewing garden and the Camellia garden, that area is just full of magnolia blooms right now. And across the path from that, or across the pond, you've got the Magnolia Cambellii striping white that if you look up into the canopy, it's a very tall tree. That one is starting to go. And a little bit further up in the garden, in the rhododendron garden, the Magnolia Cambellii late pink is starting to flower. And we're still waiting on the Vici, but yeah, so those are some of our, oh, and the Magnolia Darjeeling, which is Camellia Darjeeling, which is always some people's favorite. That one has started to bloom as well. So
Awesome, thank you so much. So we have a whole bunch of questions that are flooding in, which is quite exciting. So I'm doing my best to try and group them as much as possible. But first one, I think this would go out to Tori. Maybe Tori and I can partner up on this one. So what are the theories for why magnolias are indigenous to both the Southwest United States and also Asia?
so the southeastern United States.
Yes.
Yeah, so magnolias today, like we mentioned, you'll see in southeastern North America and in Asia. And so that actually has to do with how the continents were formerly arranged. And so prior to the breakup of all of the continents, there was a lot more, you see a lot of plants from those regions occurring in the same place. And botanists from the East Coast will often say that going to China is like walking into their own forest. Sometimes things just look really familiar. So Ryan, I don't know if you want to.
Well, yeah, so it's partly called that Eastern United States, East Asian disjunct. So essentially at one point when the continents were connected and the climate was much cooler, a lot of times you've had fossil records of species occurring across the Northern Hemisphere. And then as the continents broke apart and you started having deserts and other colder regions in between, these both eastern sides of North America and Asia have similar climates. So that's where those species tend to hold on to and still persist, where they've gotten colder and drier like Central Asia or the western part of the United States, and then they've disappeared. So the only time you find those species out in those regions is through fossil records. So they were sort of the last hold-ons in climates that were most similar to millions of years ago that they can still survive in today. Another one, what else is going on? Steve, what is your opinion of the height of bloom season?
So, as you know, magnolias don't always, or plants in general, don't always cooperate with us. I would say that typically later in this month, you could experience that. One thing I can say is that if you follow social media or follow SFBG on social media, we typically let you know when peak season is happening right on the spot. So if you're not following us on Instagram and Twitter and everything else, you should, and we'll let you know as soon as it happens.
Great. I have a question. So how does SFBG's collection of magnolias compare with collections in other American public gardens? So each year we submit our Magnolia collection amongst other gardens to BGCI. And Tori, I believe you are collecting or assisting with the collecting of more magnolia information. So we want to see which gardens have what and sort of have a comparison. And we are definitely very high on that list. But also Atlanta Botanic Garden is very high on that list as well. And so, of course, having a living collection, sometimes we get more things, sometimes some plants age out. So it's a changing number, but we are definitely one of the highest in the United States. Tori, do you have any extra comments on that and some of the you participate with?
Yeah, so as Ryan mentioned, I'm working with, our collection is one of the nationally ranked Magnolia collections as part of the American Public Gardens Associations has a plant collections network that sort of tracks gardens that have significant collections of different groups of plants, one of ours being magnolias. So I am working with that group to collect all of the gardens that are considered part of the Magnolia collection. We are currently getting everyone's inventory and seeing what magnolias people had throughout 2020. So we're still compiling those numbers, but like Ryan mentioned, we are definitely one of the like major significant magnolia collections in the country.
Thank you. There's a question about common life expectancy or longevity of magnolias. So every species is different. Magnolias can range from 100-foot tall trees to plants that only get maybe 3 feet tall, depending on the species. So, and come from a very wide variety of habitats. In general, you don't really hear about magnolia specimens being thousands of years old, but typically hundreds. So depending on which species it is and the conditions it's growing in, typically you expect anywhere between 100 to maybe up to 400 years. I've not really heard much about things lasting, magnolia species living much beyond that kind of age. Another question or an observation is that people have noticed squirrels eating our magnolia flowers and buds, and are they a favorite of squirrels? I'm gonna open this one up to Steve because you tend to be out there a lot observing them. I know squirrels tend to be an issue. What can you remark on your observations with them, Steve?
I'm sorry, I don't know that I have an observation. Yes, they do, and it's a source of protein for them, I would assume. So yeah. It's wildlife.
Yeah, we don't mind as long as they don't pull them all off, especially our favorites. Squirrels can be a bit pesky here at the garden. Let's see. Are most of magnolias deciduous or evergreen at the botanical garden? I'm curious which is more prevalent amongst the magnolia species. Tori, you've kind of talked a bit about the diversity of evergreen and deciduous species. What is your comment on that?
Yeah, so magnolias in general around the world, I think, are primarily evergreen. But some are deciduous, some will go deciduous. One of the things at our garden, ones that we might talk about as being deciduous might not actually go fully deciduous at our garden. So for instance, one of the ones we didn't talk about but is on the map, Magnolia Eye. That's considered a deciduous tree, but at our garden, because of the mild climate in San Francisco, it doesn't always go fully deciduous. And that's one Steve was mentioning, the precocious bloomers. Magnolia Eye is considered a precocious bloomer, but at our garden, you might still see leaves on the tree. So it's sort of, we have a very unique climate here, and so it doesn't always follow the exact rules. But I think we have a handful of both evergreen and deciduous magnolias. The ones in our Mesoamerican cloud forest collection, which we didn't really, we talked a little bit about the Magnolia Sharp Eye, the Magnolia guatemalensis, things like that. These are both on the map. Those are examples of evergreen ones that grow in a bit warmer climates.
Right, and as many of you are probably aware, a lot of trees that tend to go deciduous in winter, it's an adaptation to colder winters, where many of the evergreen species tend to be more tropical or mild in their climate origins. Let's see, who else do we have? There's a question about the overlap of camellias and magnolias blooming. Ours overlap quite a lot. Camellias may start just a touch earlier, but our magnolias bloom quite early as well. So they're almost neck and neck throughout the blooming season. And then also typically overlap with many of the earlier blooming rhododendrons as well. So it is a pretty great floral display over the next several weeks. Let's see. Which specific magnolias grow best in San Francisco, home gardens, or street trees? Quite a lot. There's a reason why we can grow so many different species here in San Francisco. We have that perfect little microclimate. We have pretty mild winters, mild summers, which is really great for growing a lot of species of magnolia, though there are some out there that really do prefer a lot more heat. Magnolia Grandiflora, for example, which is probably one of the most widely planted magnolia species in cultivation in the world, actually does a lot better where the summers are a lot hotter. They can survive here, but don't nearly push like you'd see them down in Alabama or Southern California. But there's a whole number of species. I really think it's you need to look at how much space do you have. If it's going to be a street tree, it's going to want a lot more irrigate. It may suffer in its growth from that lack of irrigation. So if you're looking for a nice magnolia for your home garden, I recommend you come out and do the tour and see which one inspires you and see where you can find one.
I will note just on Garden Explorer, one of the things we have, if we have the information, we do have the ultimate height and spread of any of the ones that are featured on the map. So if you want to get a sense if you could handle a 70-foot tree in your garden, Garden Explorer will have some of that information for you.
Very good. All right, so there's another question. So about Magnolia Grandiflora seems to bloom very sporadically in San Francisco. Could you explain why? And so part of that reason, since we don't really have seasons, like strong definitive seasons like you would see in other parts of the country, a lot of our plants tend to go a little wonky and go on their own rhythm. So like Tori mentioned, a lot of our deciduous species don't always go fully deciduous or push out leaves at the same time as the flowers. So for an evergreen species like Magnolia Grandiflora, which is from the hot southern hot southeastern US, they want a lot more heat, and they're also used to getting colder temperatures in the winter. So without either of those extremes to trigger it and put it into a specific seasonal rhythm, it kind of just shoots them out whenever, which is nice for us. We like to see magnolia flowers at all times of the year, but it's never going to really do a full show like you'd classically see in in warmer regions. How is the 1 minute? So how is the increasingly intense and less frequent rainfall affecting the bloom season or growth? Not entirely certain. In terms of rainfall, we do irrigate here at the garden, so that's an important thing to consider. We do supplemental irrigation. Of course, more rain is good, but a thing to consider is that many magnolias, especially the ones in southern China, where it's pretty much the highest diversity for magnolias, actually come from winter dry regions. So in its coldest months, they are not receiving rainfall, and then they're used to having monsoonal rainfall in the warmer months. So I don't think many of the species from that region are getting too affected by lack of rainfall in terms of their blooming. Of course, we want to provide we need to provide irrigation throughout the year because most magnolia species do not occur on a sand dune. So we want to make sure without any summer rain. And let's see. So I heard once that the DNA of the American magnolias had the oldest DNA. Is this information valid? Tori, do you have any, would you happen to know anything about this?
I do not, but it is something I definitely want to research. Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of like genetic analysis done on magnolias. They're a really popular group. So I'm sure there's publications out there definitely probably talking about this. So yeah, I now have a new research topic. So thank you. We will get back to you with more information.
Great. Let's see. So there's a question about why does it take so many years for magnolias to bloom? And I think it's a really great question and something that plays a big role in terms of, something to consider when we propagate magnolias. So you have two forms of propagation. You have asexual and sexual propagation. So sexual propagation is from seed. And so essentially that plant is starting as a baby and has to grow to maturity, and that to its sexual maturity, which is its ability to bloom. So every plant is different. Some species can bloom within their first year, not species of magnolias, but some plants can bloom within their first year after germinating. Other plants like magnolias can take 5, 10, as we know, up to 20 years, or maybe even longer to be a blooming maturity. But when we propagate plants clonally, you are essentially propagating from an adult specimen or from whatever maturity that specimen is in. So that helps quicken the blooming time if you propagate from a mature or sexually mature specimen. And I think we have time for one more question, and there's a whole host, and I'm trying to lump them all together. Let's see here. Steve, if there was one magnolia that you had to see this year, which one would it be?
I don't know if I can answer that. I love the Darjeeling, the Camellias. They're so old and beautiful. I love all the mature specimen we have here at the garden. If there was one, I'll put it out there because I already said it's one of my favorites, the Vici, which will be blooming in March.
Yeah, that is definitely a showstopper. If any of you can come around and visit at that time, that is just absolutely stunning. It looks like a giant pink cloud of cotton candy.
Hey,
So
Ryan, can we address the any Magnolia species that will grow well in sand? Because that's a pretty easy one. As we know, or you may or may not know, but Golden Gate Park was built over sand dunes. So pretty much any magnolia you see in our garden is growing in sand with a small amount of topsoil on there. So many magnolias, while it's not in the description that says they'll grow well in sand, they seem to do okay in our garden. So they will grow well in sand.
plenty of irrigation and garden love. Yeah. So, all right, folks. Thank you on behalf of all of us for attending our Lunch and Learn today. And I hope you were inspired to come out to the garden and grab a magnolia map and learn more about one of our most significant and showy collections. Have a wonderful day.